What could the tattoo on the arm of a woman who was pulled over by a police officer be hiding? When the officer saw the symbol, his face immediately changed. What happened next? Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The night air was heavy with the quiet hum of distant traffic, a constant undercurrent to the stillness of the suburban road. Officer Marcus Hall adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, eyes scanning the sparse vehicles that passed by. It had been a long night, filled with nothing more than routine stops and the monotony of a shift nearing its end. The reflective light from his patrol car danced faintly on the asphalt, casting shifting shadows as a few late-night travelers drove past. Marcus glanced at the dashboard clock. Almost midnight. He sighed, hoping the remainder of his shift would pass uneventfully. His thoughts drifted, the faint buzz of his radio punctuating the silence, when his attention was drawn to a vehicle approaching slowly from the intersection. The car was an old model, its black paint dulled by years of wear. What stood out most was the heavily tinted windows, concealing any view of the interior. Marcus's brows knitted together. Vehicles like this often raised his suspicion, not just because of the windows, but because such cars were often used to hide something, or someone. As the car rolled to a stop at the light, Marcus watched intently. It paused longer than necessary, even after the light turned green. A hesitation. Then it moved, albeit slowly, onto the main road. Marcus flipped on his patrol lights and eased his car into motion. The old sedan seemed to stall for a moment before its brake lights flickered. Finally, it pulled over to the shoulder. Marcus parked a few feet behind, exiting the cruiser with the precision and care born of years of experience. The night air carried a faint chill, and Marcus adjusted his belt, hand instinctively resting near his holster as he approached the driver's side. Despite the calmness of the setting, his senses were heightened. There was always a chance that the most unassuming stops could escalate. The driver's window rolled down, and Marcus was greeted by the face of a black woman in her mid-30s. Her features were tense, her eyes darting nervously between him and the rearview mirror. Her hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles pale against her dark skin. "Good evening, ma'am," Marcus began, keeping his tone neutral but firm. "Do you know why I stopped you tonight?" She hesitated, her fingers fidgeting against the leather of the wheel. "No, officer," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Your vehicle has heavily tinted windows, which is against regulation," Marcus explained. "Can I see your license and registration, please?" The woman nodded quickly, reaching for her purse. Her hands trembled as she rummaged through it, and Marcus noticed the faint glint of something on her wrist. His eyes briefly caught a tattoo, an arrow pointing upward, intersecting with a shattered clock face. It was intricate, almost artistic, but its meaning eluded him. He made a mental note to ask about it later. She handed him her license and registration, her hands shaking so much that the documents slipped slightly before Marcus caught them. "Thank you," he said, stepping back to glance at the information. Her name was Christina Walters. The car was registered in her name as well, which was at least one mark in her favor. "Where are you headed tonight, Miss Walters?" Marcus asked, looking up from the paperwork. She hesitated again, as though weighing her answer. "I'm heading to work, officer. I have the night shift." Her words came quickly, almost too quickly, as if rehearsed. Something about her tone made Marcus pause. He studied her face more closely, the tension in her jaw, the way her gaze shifted as she spoke. It wasn't just nervousness, it was fear. "Work, huh?" he said, keeping his voice steady. "Where do you work?" "At a warehouse downtown," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The answer didn't satisfy him. Something felt off, though he couldn't yet put his finger on it. "Do you mind opening your trunk for me?" he asked, stepping back to allow her to exit the vehicle. Her eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, Marcus thought she might refuse. But then she nodded, fumbling with the latch until the trunk popped open. Inside, the sight gave him pause. A cardboard box sat in the center, its flaps partially folded inward. It was filled with scattered papers, a child's worn teddy bear, and a blanket that looked as though it had been hurriedly thrown in. "What's this?" Marcus asked, gesturing toward the box. Christina's face flushed, and her hands gripped the edges of the trunk. "Just some things I'm moving," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Moving to where?" Marcus pressed, his suspicion growing. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared at the contents of the box, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of the question was too much. "It's complicated," she finally murmured. Marcus studied her carefully. The nervousness, the hesitation, the trembling hands, it all painted a picture, but one that wasn't yet complete. There was more to her story. Of that, he was certain. "All right," he said finally, stepping back. "Close the trunk and step back to the driver's side." She complied, her movements stiff and hesitant. Marcus followed, his thoughts racing. Something about this stop was different. And as he watched her settle back into the driver's seat, the faint glow of the streetlights illuminating her strained expression, he realized he was about to learn much more than he had anticipated. Marcus stood for a moment by the open driver's side door, his eyes scanning Christina Walters once more. There was something about her that gnawed at him. The tension in her body, the way she had glanced at the teddy bear in the trunk, the nervousness in her voice. All of it told him that she was hiding something. But what? "Step out of the vehicle," Marcus said, his voice steady but insistent. He didn't wait for her to reply before he reached for his radio and called in the stop. "This is Officer Hall. I've got a 1029 on Christina Walters, requesting backup." The sound of static crackled in the earpiece, the familiar hum of routine procedures. He didn't want backup just yet, but he needed time to figure out what was going on. The request would buy him a few minutes. Christina's eyes widened at his request. "Is everything okay, officer? I haven't done anything wrong." Her voice was shaky, but the fear in her eyes was palpable now. Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he motioned for her to exit the car, his hand still hovering near his sidearm. He wasn't ready to escalate things yet, but he was preparing for any eventuality. "Ma'am, please step away from the car and put your hands on the hood," Marcus instructed. His tone remained firm, professional. He could see her hands trembling as she obeyed, but he was trying to maintain control of the situation. Christina hesitated, then moved to do as he asked. "I swear, officer, I'm just trying to get to work. I have a sick mother I need to look after." Her voice cracked with emotion, and Marcus noted that she wasn't looking him in the eye anymore. Her gaze was fixed on the ground, as if she were ashamed or hiding something. Marcus took a step closer, maintaining the proper distance. "Is there anything you're not telling me, Miss Walters?" The question hung in the air, and Marcus watched her flinch at the mention of her name. "No," she replied quickly, but there was an edge of panic in her voice. "I don't know what you think is going on, but I swear I'm not a criminal." Marcus noticed the desperation in her eyes, the tears welling up in the corners. Her reaction wasn't the one he would expect from someone who was guilty of anything serious, but there was still something unsettling about the situation. The box in the trunk, the teddy bear, it was all so offbeat for a typical night shift worker. Ma'am, I'm just trying to get to the bottom of this. Can you tell me about the contents of that box? What's in it? Marcus asked, trying to remain as neutral as possible. Christina wiped her eyes, clearly struggling to keep herself together. It's just personal stuff. Things I've been carrying around for a while. Her voice shook as she spoke, and Marcus couldn't help but notice the lie that hung in the air. The box had not looked like a collection of personal items, at least not in the way someone might expect. It looked far more urgent, as if she had been in a rush, shoving things inside without much thought. I'm going to ask you again, Marcus said, leaning forward slightly. What's in that box, Miss Walters? Is it something I need to be worried about? At this, Christina's face twisted with guilt. Her breathing grew heavier, more labored, as if she were trying to control the flood of emotions that were threatening to overwhelm her. I didn't want this to happen, she whispered, almost to herself. I never wanted to be in this position. It's just that... She stopped mid-sentence, and Marcus stepped closer, his hand remaining on his holster. This wasn't an aggressive move. It was a precaution. He had no idea what she might do next, but he could feel the tension rising. She wasn't just nervous. She was terrified. Tell me what's going on, Miss Walters, Marcus urged, keeping his voice calm but steady. You're not in any trouble, but if you're hiding something, it's only going to make things worse. Christina let out a long, shaky breath and slowly turned to face him. Her expression was raw, full of fear and regret. She wasn't trying to act tough or put up a front. This was real. I'm running away, officer, she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. I'm trying to get away from him. Marcus blinked, his focus sharpening. Get away from who? Christina looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears. My husband, he's been abusive. I can't take it anymore. I've tried to leave so many times, but he always finds me. The words hit Marcus like a slap to the face. He had dealt with domestic violence cases before, but the raw pain in her voice made it clear that this wasn't just another statistic. It was a person, a mother, a wife, someone who was reaching out for help after enduring far too much. Where is he now? Marcus asked, his voice softer now, more understanding. He's probably looking for me right now, she replied, her shoulders slumping. I had to leave in a hurry. I didn't want to put my daughter in any more danger. He's always been like this, but it's getting worse. I'm just trying to get away before it's too late. Marcus felt his chest tighten as he processed what she had just said. The urgency, the desperation in her voice. It was clear that this wasn't just a simple case of fleeing from a bad marriage. This was life or death. Do you have a plan? He asked, his voice steady, though he could feel his heart rate picking up. Christina shook her head. I don't know where to go. I've tried to find help before, but I'm scared. I don't know who to trust anymore, and I don't know if I'll make it before he finds me again. Marcus felt a pang of sympathy for her. He could see now that the woman in front of him wasn't the criminal he had briefly suspected. She was a victim, a survivor, someone who had been pushed to the edge. The thought of her being hurt, of her children being in danger, sent a chill down his spine. Listen to me, Marcus said, his tone firm yet compassionate. I'm going to help you. I know people who can get you into a safe house, and I can help make sure your husband doesn't find you. Her eyes widened in disbelief. You're serious? I'm serious, Marcus replied, his voice leaving no room for doubt. But I need you to be honest with me. What else are you hiding, Christina? If there's anything else, now's the time to tell me. For a moment, Christina looked as if she were going to back away, to retreat into herself again. But then, with a heavy sigh, she nodded slowly. "I have a medical condition," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I was diagnosed with heart disease a few years ago. My doctor said I shouldn't be under this kind of stress, but I've had no choice. It's been getting worse lately, and I was afraid I wouldn't make it through the night if I didn't get out." Marcus nodded, his mind racing. This was more than just an abusive marriage. Christina was in physical danger, too. "Do you have your medication with you?" he asked, concern lacing his voice. "No," she replied, shaking her head. "I ran out. I was supposed to pick it up today, but I didn't have the chance. I couldn't risk going back there." The weight of the situation crashed down on Marcus. This wasn't just a matter of finding a safe house. This was a matter of life and death. "I'm going to help you," he repeated, this time with more urgency in his voice. "Let me take you to a safe place. We'll get your medication and we'll make sure you're taken care of. But first, I need you to trust me." Christina looked up at him, her tear-streaked face a mixture of fear and gratitude. "I do trust you," she whispered. "I just don't know what's going to happen next." Marcus placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his resolve hardening. He wasn't just a police officer anymore. He was someone who was going to make sure she made it out of this nightmare, and he wasn't going to let her fall through the cracks. "We'll figure it out together," he said firmly. "But right now, let's get you the help you need." As Marcus led Christina to his patrol car, he couldn't shake the feeling that this night would change everything for both of them. The woman standing beside him wasn't just a victim. She was a fighter, and he was going to make sure she didn't have to fight alone. Marcus didn't speak as he led Christina to his patrol car. The night had shifted, and so had the weight of the situation. As they walked, Christina stumbled slightly, her eyes unfocused, as though the reality of what she had just revealed was finally settling in. She had spoken briefly of the abuse, but there was so much more he knew she was still holding back. He opened the door of the cruiser and motioned for her to sit. She hesitated for a moment before slipping into the passenger seat, her movements stiff and slow. Her hands were trembling as she pulled the seatbelt across her chest, and Marcus could see the exhaustion in the way she held herself. "Do you need to rest for a minute?" Marcus asked, his voice softer now. "We can take a moment if you need it." Christina shook her head, her dark eyes wide as though she were still in disbelief. "No," she replied hoarsely. "I just need to get out of here. I need to keep moving before he finds me." Her voice cracked on the last word, and Marcus clenched his jaw. He didn't know exactly what she was running from, but it was clear now that this wasn't just an abusive relationship. It was something much darker. He closed the door and walked around to the driver's side, sliding into his seat with a slight sigh. He started the engine, the low hum of the car's motor the only sound in the tense silence between them. Marcus glanced over at Christina as they began driving, the streetlights flickering overhead, casting their pale glow across her face. She was staring out the window, her gaze distant, lost in thought. Marcus felt an urge to speak, to ask more questions, but he also knew that she needed space. She was clearly on the edge, and pressing her for more answers right now might make her retreat back into herself. Instead, he focused on the road, the familiar motions of driving, giving him a sense of control in a situation that was rapidly becoming anything but. Minutes passed in silence, and then Christina spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I never wanted this," she said. "I never wanted to be in this position. I didn't want to run. I just didn't have a choice anymore. Marcus kept his eyes on the road, but his heart began to ache for her. "I know," he said quietly, "but you did the right thing by leaving. You're safe now." For a moment, there was no response, just the soft sound of her breathing, shaky and uneven. Then she spoke again, her voice more broken this time. "He's been hurting me for years, officer. I don't know how it got this bad. I don't know how I let it get this far." Her words were spilling out now, and there was no stopping them. It was like I couldn't see it anymore. At first, it was small things, little insults, a shove here and there. But then it got worse. It got harder to leave, and I thought I could just go back to normal. Marcus tightened his grip on the wheel, his jaw clenched. He knew all too well how easy it was for someone to fall into that kind of cycle, especially when they had nowhere to turn. "You couldn't," he said, his voice firm, trying to reassure her. "It's not your fault. You didn't make him do those things." Christina didn't respond right away, and Marcus glanced over at her. Her face was pale, the weight of her emotions etched deeply into every line. Her eyes were focused on her hands, which were clenched tightly in her lap. "I knew what he was," she continued, her voice cracking with every word. "I knew from the beginning. He's racist. He always made me feel less than. He would tell me I wasn't good enough, that I was lucky to have him. He would tell me I was nothing without him. And I believed it. For so long, I believed it. I thought I was a problem." Marcus felt a rush of empathy for her, for all the years of torment she had endured in silence. He had seen it before, women, and men too, who stayed in abusive relationships because they thought they deserved it, because the emotional manipulation made them doubt their own worth. But it wasn't her fault. It was never her fault. "Christina," Marcus said softly, his voice low but steady, "you're not the problem. He is. And it's not too late for you to get out. You've done the hardest part already." She turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his for the first time in what felt like forever. The look in her eyes was full of raw, unfiltered emotion, fear, sadness, guilt, but also a flicker of hope. "I don't know where to go," she admitted, her voice almost pleading. "I don't know who I can trust anymore. I've been running for so long, and I'm scared he'll find me." Marcus took a deep breath, his mind already working, formulating a plan. He had dealt with enough victims of domestic violence to know how difficult it was for someone to trust again after years of manipulation and control. But he also knew that there were resources available, people who could help her, if she would let them. "You don't have to do this alone," Marcus said, his tone as gentle as he could make it. "There are shelters, support groups. I can help you get in touch with them. You don't have to keep running." Christina's eyes filled with tears, and she wiped them away hastily, but it was no use. The floodgates had opened, and the emotions she had buried for so long were finally coming to the surface. "I've tried before," she said through gritted teeth, her voice shaken. "I've gone to shelters. I've called hotlines. But every time he finds me, every time he—" Her voice broke, and she couldn't finish the sentence. Marcus let the silence stretch between them for a moment, letting her collect herself. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he also knew that she was stronger than she gave herself credit for. She had taken the first step by leaving him. Now all he had to do was help her take the next one. "I won't let him hurt you," Marcus said firmly. "I'll make sure of it. We'll get you someplace safe, and we'll make sure he can't find you. But you need to trust me." For a long moment, Christina didn't say anything. She just stared out the window, the faint reflection of the streetlights playing across her face. Marcus could almost see the weight of the decision she was making, the struggle within her. She was scared, and she had every right to be. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I trust you." Marcus's heart ached for her, and he nodded, not trusting his voice for a moment. He wasn't sure how much she believed in her own worth right now, but he would show her. He would make sure she got the help she needed. He didn't say anything else as they continued driving through the quiet streets, heading toward the nearest shelter. He could feel the weight of the night pressing down on him, the sense of urgency in Christina's words still ringing in his ears. But at least for now, she was safe. And that was a start. As the car hummed down the road, Marcus thought about the way her eyes had looked when she told him about the abuse. How hollow and empty they had seemed. It was a look he had seen in others, victims who had been broken down by the people they loved, people they trusted. But Christina was different. She had made it out, and with his help, she was going to stay out. "Don't worry," Marcus muttered under his breath, his voice almost to himself. "You'll make it. I'll make sure of it." The road ahead stretched out before them, the future uncertain. But in that moment, Marcus was certain of one thing. He was going to do everything in his power to make sure Christina's next chapter was a better one. Marcus's cruiser rolled smoothly down the quiet streets, the rhythmic hum of the engine filling the silence between him and Christina. The night had fallen even quieter since they left the intersection, the occasional car whizzing by in the distance, but the streetlights cast an eerie glow across the road, highlighting the isolation of their journey. Christina's face, normally expressive and vibrant, was now drawn, her eyes fixed out the window, as though the world outside was too much to bear. She was quiet, her words from earlier still hanging in the air, but there was a subtle shift in the way she carried herself. The weight of what she had admitted, of what she had revealed to him, was settling heavily on her. Marcus's hands gripped the steering wheel, his focus unwavering as they drove. He had been a cop long enough to know that when someone opened up to you in the way Christina had, it wasn't just about the words they spoke. It was about what they didn't say, the things they kept buried under layers of fear, guilt, and shame. She had let him see the cracks in her armor, and now she was vulnerable in ways that words couldn't fully express. But she needed more than just words. She needed to be safe, to be protected from the person who had terrorized her life for far too long. Marcus knew that the next steps were critical. "Christina," he said, his voice breaking the silence for the first time in what felt like an eternity. She didn't respond right away, but he could feel her attention shift, her shoulders stiffening slightly, as though preparing for more questions. "Yeah?" Her voice was soft, barely audible, but it held a note of quiet urgency. "I need to know what your plan is once we get you to the shelter," Marcus said gently. "Do you have anyone you can reach out to? Family? Friends?" Christina shifted in her seat, glancing toward him before quickly looking away, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. She had her seatbelt on, but her body language screamed of someone in the process of being undone. "I don't know," she muttered, almost as if to herself. "I thought I could handle it. I thought I could just go back home, maybe talk to him, make it right. But every time I go back, I get stuck. I don't have anyone anymore, not really." Marcus's heart sank at the admission. He knew that sense of isolation all too well, the feeling that everyone you once trusted had turned their back on you. It was a brutal thing to experience, but it was all too common. "Christina," he said softly, trying to keep his tone even. "You're not alone in this. I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to carry this burden by yourself." She turned toward him then, her eyes wide and filled with a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. There was a brief flicker of hope in her gaze, but it was fleeting, like a candle's flame flickering in a storm. "I don't know who to trust anymore, Marcus," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been burned so many times. I just don't know who will really help me. And the last time I tried to leave, he found me. He told me I would never get away from him, that no one would believe me." The words stung, and Marcus could see how deeply they cut her. She was still carrying the weight of that fear, the fear that no one would believe her, that she was too weak to escape, that she was too much of a mess to be worthy of help. The more he listened, the more Marcus understood the insidious hold her husband had on her, not just physically, but emotionally as well. It wasn't just the bruises she had to hide. It was the emotional scars, the constant gaslighting that had made her doubt her own worth. "You're wrong," Marcus said, his voice firm, with no trace of hesitation. "You're not weak, Christina. You've done something incredibly strong. You got out, and that's the hardest thing you could have done. Don't ever think that you're not worthy of help. You deserve better than what you've been through, and I'm going to make sure you get it." Christina's lip quivered, but she didn't say anything more. Instead, she just nodded, the faintest hint of tears threatening to spill over. The vulnerability in her eyes was something he had seen too many times before, something he could never get used to, no matter how many cases he had handled. Marcus took a deep breath, his gaze returning to the road. He had no doubt that getting Christina to the shelter was the right thing to do, but the question remained. What happened after that? How could he help her rebuild her life when she felt like she had nothing left to hold on to? They passed a few more intersections in silence, the rhythm of the car's tires on the pavement the only sound between them. The shelter was only a few miles away now. "Marcus, I'm scared," Christina finally said, breaking the silence again. Her voice was thick with emotion, her hands gripping the seatbelt tighter. "What if I don't make it? What if he finds me again?" The raw vulnerability in her words hit Marcus hard. She had been living in constant fear for so long, and now, even with the small glimmer of safety ahead of her, the fear was still there, lurking like a shadow. He glanced at her quickly, his voice softer now. "I'll make sure you're safe. I won't let him get to you, Christina. There's a lot of people who can help. There's a whole network of support, and we're going to make sure you're never alone again. But you've got to trust us, and you've got to take the next step." She nodded slowly, as if she was taking in his words, but wasn't entirely convinced. Marcus understood the hesitation. It was the kind of skepticism that only someone who had been through years of torment could carry with them. She had been conditioned to doubt others, conditioned to believe that help wasn't really help, that it was all just a temporary fix. They finally pulled into the parking lot of the shelter, the dim glow of the security lights casting shadows over the building. The shelter was quiet, as it always was at night, with a few staff members going about their duties, making sure everything was secure for the women and children staying there. It wasn't much, but it was a place to start. Marcus parked the cruiser and turned off the engine. For a moment, there was just the silence again, the quiet, uncertain lull before the storm. "Ready?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. Christina didn't answer right away. She just sat there, staring out at the building. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded. "Yeah," she said softly. "I'm ready." Marcus exhaled, his hand resting on the door handle. He had heard her say the words, but he knew there was still a long road ahead. This was just the beginning of her journey, and there would be hurdles to face. But one thing was certain. She was no longer facing them alone. He opened the door and stepped out, moving around to the passenger's side. Christina hesitated for a moment before she finally opened the door herself, her movements slow but resolute. She stepped out onto the pavement, her heels clicking softly on the ground. As they approached the shelter's front door, a staff member, a woman named Elena, greeted them. Elena had seen countless women come through these doors, each one carrying their own scars, their own fears. But there was something different about Christina. "We've got a room for you, Christina," Elena said warmly, her voice gentle but matter-of-fact. "We're here to help. You're safe now." Christina nodded, her lips trembling, but a small spark of relief flickered in her eyes. She was here. She was safe. Marcus stayed for a few more minutes, making sure Christina was settled in. He spoke with Elena briefly, relaying the most important details about Christina's situation, her health, her fear of being found. Elena assured him that they would take it from there. As Marcus turned to leave, he gave Christina one last look. Her back was straight now, her posture a little more confident than it had been when she first entered the cruiser. "I'll check in on you tomorrow," Marcus said, "but you don't need to worry. You're not alone anymore." Christina gave him a small, tentative smile, her eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "I won't forget this." Marcus nodded and turned to leave, his thoughts still with her as he walked back to his cruiser. This night had been a turning point, not just for Christina, but for him as well. He had done more than just uphold the law tonight. He had helped someone reclaim their life, and that was worth everything. The day after Marcus dropped Christina off at the shelter was one of those rare moments when everything seemed to slow down. It was still early morning when he arrived at the precinct, the world outside still locked in the quiet haze of the first hours of daylight. He had worked night shifts for years, but today felt different. He felt more alert, more aware, even though the sleep he had managed to grab felt shallow. It was as if a shadow had been lifted, or perhaps it was the calm before the next storm. Marcus settled into his desk, his hands resting lightly on the surface, fingers tapping absent-mindedly as he gazed at the paperwork in front of him. His mind kept drifting back to Christina. The way she had looked at him when she told him about the abuse, the rawness in her voice, the way she had finally said, "I trust you." Those words echoed in his mind, and despite the fact that he had been doing this job for over 10 years, the trust she had placed in him felt heavier than anything he had ever experienced. She was scared, yes, but there was more than that. There was hope buried beneath the layers of fear and self-doubt, a glimmer that she was beginning to let herself believe in. He had seen women before, victims of abuse, women running from violent husbands, broken families, but Christina was different. She didn't seem to have anyone left to lean on, no family, no friends, no one to help pick up the pieces. She was alone, truly alone, and yet she had trusted him to help her. Marcus picked up the phone, dialing the shelter's number. He knew he needed to check in on her, but he also knew that he had to tread carefully. He didn't want to invade her space, didn't want to overwhelm her with too many questions, but he also knew that this was his responsibility now. The phone rang twice before a voice picked up. "Safe Haven Shelter, this is Elena." "Hi, Elena. This is Officer Marcus Hall," he said, his tone casual but with an undercurrent of concern. I dropped off Christina Walters last night, and I just wanted to check in on her, see how she's doing." Elena's voice was calm but warm. "She's doing well. She settled in and has already started talking to our counselors. We've got her in a safe room and she's been getting some rest. She's been a little quiet, understandably, but we're keeping an eye on her." Marcus exhaled with relief. "Good to hear. Is there anything specific I should know? Anything she might need, or any additional information you think I should be aware of?" Elena paused for a moment. "Well, Christina's a bit reluctant to open up about her medical condition. She mentioned she has a heart condition, but she didn't elaborate. I'd suggest a follow-up checkup with one of our medical partners to make sure she's getting the care she needs." Marcus frowned. "I didn't realize it was that serious. I'll make sure that's taken care of." "I'll keep an eye on her," Elena added, "but it seems like she's starting to trust us. We'll give her time, but if there's anything else you need, don't hesitate to reach out." "Thanks, Elena. I appreciate it. I'll keep checking in." After hanging up, Marcus leaned back in his chair, his fingers still tapping on the desk, though now more nervously than before. He had been so focused on making sure Christina was physically safe, but her emotional recovery was just as important. The walls she had built up over years of abuse wouldn't come down overnight, but he could do his part in helping her rebuild, even if it was just offering his support. But what came next? What could he do to make sure she stayed safe? To ensure that her husband, the man who had controlled and tortured her for years, didn't find her again? Marcus had been a cop long enough to know the routine. The paperwork, the standard responses, the reports. He knew the process. But this situation wasn't routine. This wasn't a simple case of pulling someone over or investigating a robbery. This was about protecting a woman who had already been through far more than anyone should ever have to endure. And he had promised her that he would make sure she wasn't alone. The decision to take action, to do something more, felt like a heavy burden. He could put her in touch with more resources, more social workers, more shelters, more people who could help. But what could he do personally to make sure she was safe? His mind kept circling back to the question, what choice did he have now but to take things further? Around mid-morning, Marcus received a call from his partner, Detective Laura Graves. She had been with him on the force for years and knew him better than anyone. Her no-nonsense attitude was a perfect counterbalance to his more empathetic approach. "Hall," Laura said briskly, "you're not going to believe this, but we got a hit. I just found out Christina's husband has a history of violence. He's been reported multiple times by ex-girlfriends, but nothing ever sticks. He's been in and out of trouble, but he's got a clean record as far as the courts are concerned." Marcus's stomach tightened. What does that mean for Christina? "It means he knows how to work the system," Laura continued. "And he's not the type to just let her go. I've got a bad feeling about this. If he's found out where she is, things could get ugly." Marcus's hand tightened around his pen, a sharp pang of concern in his chest. "So, what do we do now?" "We need to make sure he doesn't find her," Laura said, her voice sharp with urgency. "I'll pull some strings with our intel division, see what we can dig up about him. In the meantime, I suggest you check in with Christina again. Keep an eye on her. I'll keep you posted." "I'll do that," Marcus said. "Thanks, Laura." As he hung up the phone, Marcus's mind raced. It wasn't just about keeping Christina physically safe. It was about making sure she was emotionally supported as well. He couldn't just let her go back into hiding, isolated from the world. She needed to be able to trust people again, to know that there was more out there for her than just running. But that meant making sure her husband didn't find her, and the stakes had just gotten higher. He stood up from his desk, walking to the window of the precinct. Outside, the sun had risen fully, and the city was starting to wake up. He had no intention of letting Christina go through this alone. He would do everything he could to protect her, to make sure her abuser never had the chance to hurt her again. His mind wandered back to the shelter. Christina was there now, in a safe place for the moment, but she wasn't out of the woods yet. He knew that better than anyone. The choices ahead were all about protecting her, but he also knew that the road ahead would not be an easy one. Her husband was still out there, and Marcus had to make sure Christina never had to face him again. The phone rang again, and Marcus quickly answered. It was Elena from the shelter, and her tone was far more urgent than before. "Officer Hall, Christina's gone missing. She disappeared this morning. We don't know where she went, but her things are gone. Her bed's been made, and there's no sign of her anywhere." Marcus's heart dropped. This wasn't just a case of someone feeling overwhelmed and running. This was something far worse. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, he said, his voice tight with urgency. As he hung up, his instincts kicked in. Christina had left, and that meant her husband was probably closer than anyone realized. Marcus's mind raced through the possibilities. Was she trying to escape on her own, or had something worse happened? Either way, he couldn't afford to waste time. He grabbed his jacket and rushed out of the precinct, every step heavy with the weight of the responsibility he felt for Christina's safety. He had promised her that she wasn't alone, but now, more than ever, he was realizing the true extent of what that promise meant. There was no turning back now. Marcus wasn't just a cop anymore. He was a protector. And if Christina was in danger, he was going to do everything in his power to stop her past from catching up with her. The feeling of urgency that Marcus had felt when he received the call from Elena about Christina's disappearance gripped him like a vice as he raced toward the shelter. His thoughts were a jumble of concern, frustration, and determination. It had only been a few hours since he had spoken with Elena, yet it felt like days had passed, the tension hanging over him like a storm waiting to break. Christina had been through so much already, and now, just when he thought she had found a moment of peace, she had vanished. His heart pounded in his chest as he sped down the street, the flashing lights of his cruiser cutting through the quiet early morning fog. Every red light felt like an eternity as he raced to the shelter, mentally running through the possible reasons for Christina's disappearance. Had she left of her own accord, overwhelmed by the weight of everything she had been through? Or had someone found her? Had her husband finally caught up with her? Marcus tried to tamp down the rising panic inside him, but the thought of Christina being out there alone, vulnerable and terrified, sent waves of dread through him. He had promised her safety. He had promised he wouldn't let anything happen to her. He pulled into the shelter's parking lot, the tires of his cruiser skidding slightly on the wet pavement. He was out of the car before it had even fully stopped, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. Inside, Elena was waiting for him by the front door, her face pale with concern. "She's gone," Elena said, her voice tight with panic. "I've checked everywhere. Her room, the common areas, all the doors. It's like she just disappeared." Marcus nodded grimly. "Did she leave any messages? Any indication where she might have gone?" Elena shook her head, her hand running through her hair in frustration. "Nothing. I thought she was doing well. She was quiet, but I thought that was just her processing things. Then, this morning, she was just gone. No sign of struggle, no sign of anything unusual. It doesn't make sense. Marcus's mind raced as he took in the situation. He had to remain focused, he knew that. Christina wasn't just someone who had run away. She was someone who had been trying to escape a dangerous situation. She had been terrified of being found, and now she was missing. "Who else has access to the building?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts inside his head. "Anyone who could have helped her leave without anyone noticing?" Elena hesitated, clearly processing the question. "There's a night shift staff member, but she was working in the back room last night. She didn't see anything unusual. And there's security cameras at the entrance, but they don't cover the back of the building. Christina could have slipped out that way. But she wouldn't have just left without telling us. Something's not right." "Do you have a list of people she's been in contact with?" Marcus pressed. "Friends? Family? Anyone she might have reached out to?" "I've got her file," Elena replied, turning toward the back office. "But if you're thinking she might have contacted someone and left on her own, I doubt it. Christina doesn't have many people left. Her family is scattered, and she's been trying to distance herself from everyone she knew because of her husband. We've been her lifeline. She wouldn't just cut us off." Marcus's thoughts turned back to the earlier conversation he had had with Laura, his partner. Laura had warned him that Christina's husband could be the one to have found her. If he had finally tracked her down, it would explain her sudden disappearance. Marcus's gut told him that's exactly what had happened. He just didn't know how or when it had occurred. He followed Elena to the back office where she handed him Christina's file. It was thin. There wasn't much to go on. But as Marcus flipped through the pages, one detail stood out to him: a phone number. It was listed under emergency contacts, but the name was unfamiliar. Samantha Walters' cousin. Marcus narrowed his eyes. He hadn't heard this name before. It wasn't a lead he had been expecting, but it was the only contact listed, and it could be the key to finding Christina. "We need to talk to Samantha," Marcus said, his voice decisive. "I need to know if Christina reached out to her. I'll take it from here. You stay on the phone with the rest of the shelter staff and see if anyone remembers anything unusual." Elena nodded, her expression tight with anxiety. "You think it's him, don't you?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He didn't have the proof, but he felt it deep in his bones. Her husband was involved. It was the only thing that made sense. "I'll be in touch," Marcus said as he turned toward the door, the file still clutched in his hand. The rain had begun to fall heavily, the droplets hissing against the pavement as he climbed back into his patrol car. He quickly punched in the number for Samantha Walters, praying she would pick up. The phone rang 3 times before a voice answered, breathless as if she had just been running. "Hello? This is Officer Marcus Hall. I'm looking for Samantha Walters." "This is she," the voice replied, a mix of confusion and curiosity in the tone. "How can I help you?" "I'm investigating the disappearance of your cousin, Christina Walters. I was wondering if you'd spoken with her recently, or if you have any information that might help us find her." There was a long pause, and Marcus could hear the sound of muffled breathing on the other end. Finally, Samantha spoke, her voice much softer now. "I haven't heard from Christina in weeks," she said, her tone laced with uncertainty. "I know she was staying in a shelter, but she never reached out to me. We don't talk much. She has her reasons for that." Marcus's pulse quickened. "Do you have any idea where she might have gone? Any friends or family she might have contacted? It's important we find her." Samantha was silent for a moment before speaking again, her voice tinged with guilt. "I don't know, but I'm pretty sure I know where she might have gone. She used to talk about going back to her hometown, but that was before everything happened. She never said she would, though." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. Her hometown. If Christina had gone back there, it meant she was either trying to escape again, or she had gone back to find something, or someone. "Where is her hometown?" Marcus asked, his voice sharper now, all his focus on the lead. "It's a small town, outside of the city. It's called Ashfield. But, like I said, I don't think she's gone back. I just don't know where else she would go." "Ashfield," Marcus repeated, his mind racing. This was it. It was a lead, a direction he could follow, but it also meant that Christina was heading straight into the past she was trying to escape. And if her husband was involved, that meant things could get dangerous fast. "Thank you, Samantha. You've been helpful. I'll keep in touch if I need more information." "Please," Samantha pleaded, her voice shaking. "If you find her, tell her I'm sorry. I know I wasn't there for her, but I never wanted her to feel like she had no one." Marcus nodded, even though she couldn't see it. "I'll let her know." As he hung up the phone, Marcus felt the weight of the situation settle heavily on his shoulders. Christina was in Ashfield, and if her husband was tracking her, he wouldn't be far behind. He punched the address for Ashfield into his GPS and pulled away from the shelter, his heart pounding with every mile. Time was running out. The only question now was whether he would make it in time. The drive to Ashfield seemed to stretch on for hours, though it was only a little over an hour from the shelter. The rain had intensified, pouring down in thick sheets, and the windshield wipers worked overtime to clear the view ahead. Marcus's mind, however, was a blur of thoughts, the wheels of his brain spinning as quickly as the tires beneath him. Christina's disappearance weighed on him more heavily with each passing minute. It wasn't just about finding her anymore. It was about making sure she was safe. Her husband, the man who had tormented her for years, was still out there, and Marcus had no doubt that he would do whatever it took to track her down. That meant Christina was in grave danger. He glanced at the GPS screen, watching the distance to Ashfield dwindle. The small town was tucked away in a remote part of the state, a place that felt like it existed outside the fast pace of the city. It was a place where people went to disappear, where the past could creep up on you when you least expected it. And for Christina, it was a place that could either be her sanctuary or her undoing. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white in the dim light of the dashboard. He had been in situations like this before, chasing down suspects, trying to keep someone safe. But this was different. Christina was different. She wasn't just a case to solve. She was a person, a woman who had been broken by the very system meant to protect her. He had to find her before it was too late. The town of Ashfield was nestled among rolling hills, the buildings sparse but sturdy, the streets eerily quiet under the heavy downpour. As he drove through the main stretch of town, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something he couldn't control. He pulled into a small, unmarked lot at the edge of town and parked the cruiser under a tree for cover. His mind kept returning to the phone call with Samantha, the cousin who had told him about Christina's hometown. The fact that Christina might have come here, to a place where she thought she could escape her past, made the situation all the more fragile. Marcus stepped out of the car, the rain hitting his face as he adjusted his jacket. His thoughts were consumed by one question. Where had Christina gone? He had no answers yet, but he knew he couldn't wait. He made his way down the street, passing by small houses and storefronts that had seen better days. The town felt frozen in time, as if it had long ago stopped growing, stopped evolving. And it made sense. This was a place to retreat to hide from the world. But for Christina, it wasn't just a quiet retreat. It was a reminder of everything she had tried to leave behind. The more Marcus walked, the more he began to feel the weight of his own steps. He was getting closer. He could feel it. And yet, the stillness around him only made everything seem more intense, more uncertain. He checked in with the local police station once he had reached the center of town. There wasn't much of a station, just a small building with a few officers on duty, handling mostly minor infractions and the occasional lost dog. The place felt like a remnant of a simpler time, but Marcus knew that nothing here was simple. Inside, the receptionist gave him a cursory glance before leading him back to a small office. The officer behind the desk was an older man, his graying hair and worn face suggesting that he had seen a lot in his time in Ashfield. He was sitting behind a desk, sipping coffee from a mug that read, "Best Grandpa." Marcus didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I'm looking for Christina Walters. Have you seen her?" The officer's eyes narrowed slightly. "I can't say I have, son. Ashfield's not exactly a place where people just wander in and out. You might want to check the motels. Some folks come through here to lay low, but they don't usually stick around long." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. "Do you have any local motels? Anything that might be off the beaten path?" The officer nodded slowly. "There's one a few miles down the road, on the edge of town. Quiet place. Not many questions asked." "Is it the kind of place where someone might hide?" Marcus asked. The officer eyed him for a moment, then shrugged. "Could be, but if she's here, you're not going to find her unless she wants you to." Marcus took the man's advice and thanked him, though he wasn't satisfied with the answer. He didn't have time to waste, and if Christina had really come back here, he needed to find her fast. The rain had let up a little as he made his way back to the cruiser. He was more determined than ever now. He punched in the address for the motel and drove quickly, the road winding through trees and small fields, each passing moment stretching the distance between him and Christina. As he approached the motel, the buildings loomed out of the mist like forgotten sentinels. It was a one-story place, with flickering neon lights casting a cold glow on the parking lot. The small sign above the entrance read, "Ashfield Inn." Marcus parked his car in the lot and glanced around. The place seemed quiet, almost too quiet. The windows of each room were dim, and there was no sign of life. It was the kind of place where people went to disappear, where the weary could seek shelter without anyone asking questions. He stepped out of the car, his boots making soft thuds against the wet ground as he walked toward the office. He could feel the weight of the moment settling on his chest. Christina had to be here. If she was, he needed to find her before her husband did. The door of the office creaked open as Marcus stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and cigarettes. A tired-looking woman was sitting behind the counter, her eyes half closed as she glanced up at him. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice flat. "I'm looking for a woman, Christina Walters," Marcus said, his voice calm but insistent. "Have you seen her? She might be staying here." The woman squinted at him for a moment, her expression unchanging. "No one by that name. You sure you got the right place?" Marcus took a deep breath, his instincts telling him that this was a dead end. He hadn't expected the receptionist to have any real answers, but it was the kind of place where someone might come to hide if they didn't want to be found. And he had a feeling that Christina was here, or at least she had been. "Are you sure no one's checked in under that name?" Marcus pressed, his tone shifting slightly. "It's very important." The woman stared at him for a moment before shaking her head. "I told you, no one by that name. But if you're looking for someone, I suggest you check the back. A few people hang around back there at night. Not my business." Marcus's gut tightened. He nodded and turned toward the back of the motel. He walked through the parking lot, passing by a row of doors, each one leading to rooms that might hold answers or dead ends. As he reached the far side of the motel, his heart skipped a beat. There, in the dim light, he saw a figure standing by one of the doors. Thin, hurried movements, a figure he recognized. It was Christina. Her hair was wet, her clothes ragged, and her face was pale with fear. She looked up as she noticed him, her eyes wide with panic. "Marcus, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. Before he could reach her, a figure appeared in the doorway. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, and with a familiar face. Christina's husband, the very person Marcus had feared would show up. The chase had only just begun. Marcus's heart slammed against his chest as he stared at Christina's husband, who stood blocking the door, his eyes cold and calculating. The man was tall, built like a brick wall, and wore the kind of expression that made it clear he wasn't here to negotiate. This was the moment Marcus had feared, the moment when the past Christina was running from had caught up with her. And now, it was up to Marcus to make sure she didn't go back. Christina froze, her eyes wide with terror, and her body stiffened, as though she were a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming vehicle. Marcus could see the fear in her face, the way her lips trembled as she took a step back, trying to retreat into the shadows. "No," she whispered urgently, her voice barely above a breath. "Please don't." Marcus felt a surge of protective instinct, but he knew that he couldn't let his emotions dictate his actions. Not here. Not now. "Stay behind me, Christina," he said firmly, though his voice remained calm. He could feel his own pulse quicken, adrenaline flooding his system, but he fought to stay composed. This was about more than just stopping an abusive husband from doing more harm. It was about making sure that Christina got out of this alive and that she stayed safe. Her husband, a man named Brian, sneered and took a step forward. His hands were balled into fists, his face flushed with rage. "You're making a mistake, officer," he growled, his voice rough and low. "She belongs with me. She's my wife." Marcus didn't flinch, though he could feel the tension thickening in the air. Brian was used to controlling the narrative, used to silencing Christina with intimidation and violence. But Marcus wasn't going to let that happen here. "She doesn't belong to you," Marcus said, his voice steady, but the weight of those words was enough to stop Brian in his tracks. "She's not your possession. She's a person, and she's here because she wants to be safe from you." Brian's face twisted into a look of sheer contempt. "Safe?" He spat on the ground, his eyes never leaving Marcus. "She's just a worthless piece of trash who thinks she can run from me. I'll make sure she pays for this." Christina took another step back, her fear palpable. Marcus could see her trying to shrink into the corner, her body trembling as she whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. I can't live like that anymore." "Shut up," Brian barked, turning toward her with a venomous glare. "You don't get to talk. Not after what you've done. You think I won't find you? You think you can run from me?" Marcus's instincts kicked in. He knew this was a powder keg ready to explode, and every second he spent here talking was one more second that put Christina in danger. Brian wasn't just angry. He was dangerous, and Marcus could see the way his body was coiled, ready to snap. "Brian," Marcus said, his tone turning hard, "you're not going to hurt her. Not tonight, not ever again. You can walk away now, or you can face charges, but you're not taking her anywhere." The threat hung in the air, and for a moment there was a tense silence. Brian's nostrils flared as he stared at Marcus, his fists unclenching and clenching, but something in his eyes faltered. Marcus could see the way his confidence was slipping, just a little. "I don't care about your threats," Brian spat, his voice rising with fury. "You think you can protect her? You don't know what you're dealing with." Marcus stepped forward, his body language commanding, but not hostile. He wasn't here to escalate the situation. He was here to defuse it, to protect Christina. "I don't care about your threats either," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the tension. "You've already crossed the line. You're a danger to her, and I'll make sure you never hurt her again." Brian took a step back, but he wasn't done yet. He was testing Marcus, seeing how far he could push. "You don't know anything about me, officer," Brian said, his voice laced with venom. "You don't know the things I've done, the things I'm capable of." Marcus's eyes narrowed. He was done with the posturing. The time for talking was over. "I don't need to know anything about you, Brian," Marcus said coldly. "What I know is that you're not getting past me, and you're not taking her. You're done here. Walk away now, or I'll arrest you." The threat of arrest was enough to make Brian pause. He took another step back, but the anger still burned in his eyes. "You think this is over?" he sneered. "You think you've won?" Marcus didn't say anything, but he didn't need to. The message was clear. Brian had no power here. Christina's eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else in them now, a glimmer of hope. She took a tentative step forward, as if she were testing whether the world outside of her husband's grip was real. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice broken but resolute. "I can't keep living like this. I've already lost so much. I can't lose myself, too." Marcus turned his attention back to Brian. "You heard her," he said, his voice final. "This is over. You can either walk away and face the consequences of your actions, or you can force me to take you in. The choice is yours." For a long moment, Brian just stared at him, his breathing shallow and erratic. He was seething with rage, but beneath that anger, Marcus could see something else: fear. The realization that he had lost control of the situation, that his power over Christina was slipping away. Finally, Brian took one last look at Christina, his expression dark and hateful. "This isn't over," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "I'll be back for you. And when I do, you'll regret this." Marcus didn't flinch even as Brian turned on his heel and stalked off into the darkness. The sound of his footsteps faded into the distance, and for a moment, it felt like the world had held its breath. Christina let out a shaky breath, and Marcus turned to her. Her eyes were wide, filled with tears that were now freely streaming down her face. But there was a sense of relief in her expression, too, a weight that had been lifted, a burden shared. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked, his voice soft now. Christina nodded, but her breath hitched as she tried to steady herself. "I'm so sorry. I didn't want to drag you into this. I didn't mean to get you hurt." Marcus shook his head, stepping closer to her. "You didn't drag me into anything. I'm here because I want to be. I'm here because I'm going to make sure you're safe." Her body trembled, but she nodded, her hands wiping at her face. "I just want to be free of him. I want to live without fear." "You will," Marcus promised. I'll make sure of it. You're safe now, Christina. You're not alone anymore." For the first time in what felt like forever, she let out a small, relieved laugh through her tears. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to thank me," Marcus replied. "Just know that you're going to be okay. You don't have to go back to him. You have a choice now." As the night air settled around them, the weight of the moment began to sink in. The fear, the tension, it was all still there. But there was something else now, a new beginning, a second chance. And for Christina, that was everything. "Let's get you somewhere safe," Marcus said, his voice steady, though his heart was still pounding. He didn't know what the future would hold for Christina, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let her go through it alone. Together, they walked back toward the motel parking lot, the first step in a new chapter for both of them. And while the road ahead wouldn't be easy, at least now they were on it together. If you liked this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Share this video with your friends. Maybe it will inspire someone. Leave a comment and write what you think about our story. See you in the next video.